Hello and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where mental health professionals get together and talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, and today I am joined by probably the guest who has the coolest name out of anyone I've had on so far. I'm joined by Megan Von Fricken. Megan, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
How hard was it for you to not advertise your practice with frickin' as an adjective thrown in there as like your frickin' therapist or something like that?
You know, growing up with that last name, it was somewhat of a definite talking point, and people generally loved it. And my last name in youth group, because I grew up religious, was Frickin. Everybody called me Frickin. So I was not feeling thrilled about carrying this name into my professional world, to be honest with you.
Sure.
But I've actually gotten a lot of really good feedback. People are like, you seem like a famous person. You seem like somebody who's going to be super memorable. So now I embrace it.
Yeah, very cool. I was laughing. I usually tell my wife kind of who's lined up for the podcast and stuff. And we had joked for years about naming our child Silas Frickin Schumacher. Like Frickin was going to be his middle name.
Wow.
And I chickened out. She was on board. I was like, that's a little, I don't want to saddle a child with that. They're going to get made fun of during school, but
yeah,
it was talked about for a long time. So anyway, didn't mean to trigger you on any sort of
I've worked trauma. Through all of my name trauma, so no worries there.
How I like to start the podcast is always asking, how did you get into the field? What got you started with mental health?
So it was a circuitous route, as I'm sure it is for many people, but I can say that it was rooted in believing that it was my calling from God to help people.
Okay.
And that is relevant because I know we will be talking about our backgrounds with religious trauma, and that's a specialty for both of us. But I did grow up very religious, and I grew up in an evangelical Christian space. And the people in that space really viewed mission work as the highest calling from God. Like that evangelism and spending your life in evangelism was the best thing that you could do during your time here on earth. I disliked the idea of foreign mission work. I don't know why. I think it just kind of terrified me because I grew up in a very rural, small community. So going out into the world in that way just seemed pretty terrifying. So I recentered my focus to the US. Like there's tons of people here who need help. And so when I went to college, I carried that with me. I want to go into a profession where I can help people. And I ended up going for a degree in social work, a bachelor's degree in social work. At that point, I didn't really know what a therapist was. I'd never been to counseling. And my family had some peripheral interaction with Christian counseling when my parents were going through a divorce, but I didn't know about therapists really as, a profession. So I just wanted to help people. And once I graduated with my bachelor's, I was working in a skilled nursing facility or nursing home, as most people call them. And after a year of that, I was like, this is really not for me. So I went back to grad school for my master's in social work, and I decided I wanted to work with humans on the other end of the spectrum, not at the end of their life, but at the beginning of their life, so that they could have a better quality of life for the life that they were living. So I specialized in play therapy in my graduate education, and then started very quickly out of grad school. I did community mental health for a little bit, but then also got looped into a group private practice because they needed somebody to work with children. So that's kind of how I got started as a therapist and in the private practice space, I guess you could say.
Yeah. How was like your religious upbringing about going to college and getting a degree? I don't know if you went to a private or Christian university or how that was. Was education like something that was kind of side-eyed questioningly, or was that something that was supported in your growing up years?
It's an interesting question. I was homeschooled, and
Okay.
homeschooling was very much a part of my indoctrination. We used a Christian curriculum, and the goal was to keep us separate from the world.
Hmm.
So I grew up actually being pretty fearful of the world,
Yeah.
very isolated. We went to very small churches. But education was something that my grandparents really valued, and they were very much a part of my homeschool experience. Both of my parents had a high school education. Neither one of them went to college. My grandmother did not go to college either, but she was a lifelong learner, and I think instilled that in me. So even though the idea of going to college was very anxiety producing because I had been so sheltered, I knew I wanted to pursue education. It was never a question that I would go to a Christian school, though.
Sure. Yeah.
That wasn't even on my radar personally. Like I wouldn't even, that was just too scary to even think about going to a school that wasn't a Christian school that was pretty close to home. So I went to a small private Christian school about 2 hours from where I grew up, and that was supported by my community. I remember my youth pastor and his wife at the time were concerned because this particular school was considered more progressive
Sure.
than some of the Bible colleges that our church was supportive of people going to. But for some reason, I didn't follow their directive on that. I stuck with the one that I had picked. And I'm really glad I did, because some of the progressive viewpoints of that university that I went to were the first cracks in my rigid foundation and belief structure.
Sure. Yeah. I was, I think, different but similar, right? Like a lot of people who go through deconstruction have similar stories. My family prized education. So both my parents are teachers. So that concept of like going to school was very important, and they couldn't really backtrack it by the time I was picking colleges. Like, I was a good student, I got good grades. I had ADHD unbeknownst to everyone except for me, but like I had good grades. And so it was like, oh, well, you can get scholarships to these like world-renowned colleges. And then it was like, but maybe you should go to the Christian college in our hometown. And I was like, no, like
Okay.
0% chance. Why would I do that?
Wow.
So I think growing up with that like idea, and then there was that push to go pick the Christian college. There was that push to, both my parents went to Christian colleges. One of my sisters went to Christian college. So it was like that push was there. But I think in my family, because education had been so prized, I kind of got to sidestep that, which was really helpful for me in experiencing like science from not a young earth creation perspective.
Did you go to a public school, or what was your education growing up?
My education was all parochial school. So my parents are teachers, but they're Lutheran teachers. So they taught at the high school in the area, the Lutheran high school. And so I was Lutheran, evangelical Lutheran K through 12.
Okay.
And so, yeah, 60,000, I was University of Minnesota. That's cool. That college experience was like eye-opening for me, but not necessarily, as you said, cracks in the foundation started to show up. Like, I wasn't that person who went to college and was like, oh, I don't believe this anymore. I just kind of kept moving more and more liberal over time until finally being like, I don't believe any of this. But what was that journey then from you, from working in the field to where does kind of the deconstruction fit in your timeline?
Yeah. So when I went to grad school, the grad school I went to was closer to where I grew up. So I moved home for a time while I was in grad school, and ended up going back to churches in my local community again, which were very conservative. So I noticed some things happening in the religious communities post education, and even while I was in grad school, because with social work, we're as a profession, hopefully anti-racist. We are supportive of human evolution and mental health and addressing harms and injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that that's what my religious community did too. And then I realized that that was not the case. And I saw harms being perpetrated in these religious communities that began to make me feel really disillusioned about the culture of that community and about that religious group, evangelicalism in general. So attending church, and I was a Sunday school teacher of little kids at this time, and I just remember every Sunday morning, I would have been about 23, 24 at this time, waking up and just feeling dread about going to church. I didn't want to teach these little kids. It's not because I didn't like these little kids, because I had a play therapy certification. Right. I liked working with little kids, but it just didn't feel aligned. I didn't have the language yet to know that's what was happening, that what I was up against was something that had become fundamentally out of alignment with my values that I was getting in touch with and starting to realize that we're there all along, but that this church community wasn't aligned with that. So I didn't really confront it, or I wasn't able to really acknowledge it while I still lived in that community. I ended up meeting somebody who was living in Washington State. He was living in Pennsylvania at the time, but was in the military. So when we got married, I moved out to Washington State, and we just never found a church when I got there.
Yeah.
So I look at that as creating space to detox from this culture that I grew up in. And over a couple of years, I would say my late 20s to about 30, I was able to kind of go through that full deconstruction process. I met people who were non-religious or were more new age spirituality, which I grew up thinking was evil and scary and of the devil, of course, and realizing there's good people here that aren't part of evangelicalism or any, particular faith group. And they're actually kinder and more compassionate to humanity than many of the people that I was exposed to in my religious community. And again, the cracks in the foundation happened in college because I started to see that Christians had other perspectives on the Bible and on creation and things like that. And so it got me thinking, okay, why does this tiny church in central Pennsylvania think that they have cornered the market on religion and the truth with a capital T? There are other Christians with different perspectives. Like, it can't be possible that they all got it wrong. So those were the initial cracks. And then once I detoxed from it altogether by moving across the country and was exposed to people who were non-religious, that's when it kind of all felt like a house of cards.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love, you and I connected on Instagram, I think, just your posts around how like indoctrination works and some of the ways in which cult mind control plays out in even mainstream Christianity, which a lot of people don't think of as a cult, but a lot of those same behaviors exist. So what was that, just through doing therapy with people? Was that important for your deconstruction to kind of dig in and understand that? What was that process like for you?
Well, there's layers to my experience here. So stepping away from religion was sort of the first layer. And then I encountered the term religious trauma. Mm-hmm. And I didn't actually, even in my professional work, I didn't really, or hadn't really encountered that term before. Like, I knew people had really adverse religious experiences, but that was always sort of the extreme fringe, like mainstream churches didn't do that.
Yeah.
So I began to hear about this term religious trauma, and aspects of it fit, but it didn't really seem to fully fit my experience because I wasn't having nightmares and flashbacks and severe triggers and, you know, these pronounced aversions to things that people who have traditional trauma, or how it's talked about, tend to experience. But I knew that it was really messed up and it really hurt me and was harmful to me. So I was grappling with that for a while, and, you know, was able to acknowledge that these are traumatic things that happened. But it wasn't until actually within this last year that I read Combating Cult Mind Control, which I know you're a big fan of Stephen Hassan's work too, that everything clicked into place for me. And I realized that the harm, and I now talk more about religious harm than religious trauma. I think religious trauma falls under the umbrella of religious harm, but that it was about the mind control, and it was about the indoctrination, and it was about the isolation from the world, and how I wasn't able to develop a sense of self, that it was all put onto me by this structure. So when I think about cult mind control now, so that is a huge part of my work now, because that's been the missing piece all along. I do apply it to most of my community are ex-evangelicals, ex-Mormons, and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. Some ex-Catholics and other kind of then fringe groups outside, but pretty mainstream groups that are really resonating with my work and these concepts around indoctrination and cult mind control. And so that's how it started. That was sort of the second layer. It was detoxing from religion, resonating a bit with religious trauma, but then realizing, no, this was coercive control and indoctrination. And that's where the real harm in my experience was.
Yeah. I think, well, we can talk about this too, but my deconstruction, I tell my story in other places, but was a long time. Like, I moved liberal, I moved more and more progressive, and then like kind of took it as like, I'm an ally to the LGBTQ community. I'm going to help these people. I'm like the safe space for people, for those Christians who don't fit the big umbrella. Like, I'm that safe person, without realizing that, like, right, that just meant we didn't need to be in the church anymore. But once I kind of was like fully out of it, having kids was a big difference for me, because I was like, I can't teach my kids the things I don't believe anymore. But then it was one of those things where like I had to dig in and kind of like intellectualize a lot of it, because that's how I was raised and how my brain processes things. Education was highly prized. So like digging into what does religious trauma look like, and starting to like peel back all those things and start to understand undue influence and the control methods that are happening. And so for me, that was really helpful, where I kind of needed to have that big picture view, so that I could understand not only my own experience, but then I went back and got my certification so I could work with other people who were dealing with religious trauma or religious harm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think intellectualizing is huge for me as well. It's actually my own therapy experience have had to connect more to the feeling self and my emotions, because I want to understand on a cognitive level what's been going on. So I can totally relate to what you're saying there, that I needed to put all the pieces together and to have it make sense in my mind. And now I feel like it does all make sense in my mind. And I want to share that with everybody else, because it's a missing piece for many people, I think. Yeah.
And I think, well, I have ADHD, so I tend to be a top-down processor. So like all that information was helpful for me. And then it was like I could do the work. So similar, like my therapist often is, and she was my first guest on the podcast. Like she's great because she will often just be like, why don't we just do some breaths? And I'll be like, I don't want to do breaths. Like I know that breathing's important. I do therapy. Like I want to talk about the intellectual part. And she's like, yeah, but wouldn't it be good to check in with your body? And I'm like, oh, yes, it would be good, but I don't want to do that. So it's like that. And for me and a lot of the clients I work with, like spiritual bypassing has been such a helpful concept to understand of like, oh, right. Like I was intellectualizing by quoting scripture or using this cliched term. Like that was all a way to avoid discomfort in my own experience so that I could kind of keep my head in the sand and not have to deal with any heavy stuff.
Yes. My first therapist, and I didn't go to therapy until I was like, 31 or 32, because I thought I had all the answers, unfortunately, which I clearly did not. So she was an EMDR therapist, but she would open every session with a meditation that would last for 10 or 15 minutes. Our sessions were 90 minutes. That's how she structured it, because she wanted to have that opportunity to bring people into their bodies. And she was a yoga instructor. And so I picked her because of that, because I knew that my intellectualizing was an escape, as you kind of identified. And I'm self-diagnosed with ADHD. I don't have a formal diagnosis, but I feel like I know the ins and outs of the symptoms. And that was something I realized about myself also within the last couple of years. And so just realizing how my brain works and processes information has been really important, but it's also helped me, as your therapist helped you, realize I need to tune into my body more. And so that's become a huge part of my work with my clients now. And I had to do that work myself in therapy to almost make peace with my body and to identify what it was telling me. And so much of our experiences with religion detach us from our body. I don't know if that was your experience as well, but I think when you are up against things like purity culture and being told that your body is sinful and base, and you have these urges that are not aligned with holiness, it's the soul is what is holy, and the body, though it's a temple, the body is not. It's kind of separate from the part of you that will live on in eternity with God.
Right.
So making peace with my body and realizing this is all connected and the body gives you signals that are really important was a huge part of my healing, and has been super healing and an important part of therapy, and super healing for people that I work with. Yeah.
The kind of God first, church second, then family, and you're nowhere in that priority list. And I loved, this is a podcast, so people can't see what you're doing, but you put your body in is a temple in quotes, because it's like, that is something that gets said, but that's not something that gets experienced. Like it is, my brand of evangelicalism was like, the devil, the world, and your sinful flesh. Like we heard that over and over and over again. So like not trusting your body. And then I had ADHD. I did not get diagnosed formally until I was in post-grad. So I've done most of my schooling. Super helpful to get my diagnosis that late. But I've been, I was ignoring, in order to be functional, so much of what my body was doing, because I didn't know how to compensate appropriately. I didn't know how to regulate my body. And there was all this pressure to get good grades and do all these things. And so it was just kind of like a death grip, a white knuckle, like ignore everything and just like get the stuff done so that you can get through this, which was a miserable existence. But it's also like how I kind of checked all the boxes everybody else presented for me. And so deconstruction and then going to a therapist, my therapist practices Buddhism. So like I picked somebody super outside of my comfort level, which was really good. Which was really good to then have somebody from that different perspective be like, well, like, that's not healthy. Like your therapist brain knows that's not healthy. Why don't we do something different? It's like, oh, what a novel idea.
Right. I think people with ADHD really suffer in a unique way in these high control religions because the expectations of high control religions are not something that most people with ADHD are able to successfully do, like long prayer times or devotions, morning devotions, or other spiritual practices that are very prescribed, these long church services. And it's just something that's very difficult for people with ADHD. And so then they think that they're not spiritual enough or they're not close enough to God because they're not doing these practices. The other thing with ADHD, with the dopamine component to it, those low moods or those dips, I think a lot of people who struggle with ADHD think that, again, that it's a spiritual issue. Why don't I feel more fulfilled and content? Why is this so difficult for me? And it becomes self-loathing in a way.
Yeah.
And just that sense of never being able to measure up or being what God wants you to be. So people with other mental health issues, of course, struggle in other unique ways, but that's something that I do talk about too, is how these religions interact with underlying, so neurodivergence, and then underlying mental health conditions, and how these religions exacerbate or perpetuate or even create some of these conditions.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because it's one of those things where I see where religion, the very conservative fundamentalist religion, played on my ADHD in that my brain likes black and white thinking. And so like getting all these rules, it was hard for me to be consistent with them, but I liked applying them to other people. And like when that gets rewarded, then you get some dopamine from that. And then you keep doing that over and over and over again. So I've talked about it as kind of this double-edged sword. I experienced never fitting in, and not that I didn't have friends, not that I didn't socialize, but like where evangelicalism is made for white males, like I didn't experience that privilege. I know I benefited from it, but like I always had kind of this like middle finger to the law approach to things that I really shouldn't have. And it was just because it was like my neurodivergence screaming at me of like, this is all so neurotypical and it's not you. So I think when I talk about organized religion as social control, it's one of those things where like it's definitely geared towards neurotypical, and neurodivergence is going to bump against that, sometimes very hard, and sometimes it's just going to be like a consistent bump against this wall that doesn't kind of work for you.
That's such a good point. And I've heard that from people in my community, that high control religious groups can be very supportive in a way to some aspects of ADHD or neurodivergence because of the black and white thinking and the rules, and everything's just given to you. These guidelines are given to you. So even though it ultimately becomes a source of distress for people in many ways for never being able to really live up or feel like they belong, it's appealing because it gives you that structure. So
yeah, right.
I really
and early in my career, I worked at a homeless shelter, and seeing a lot of people in high level mental health issues, breaks with reality, schizophrenia or bipolar that is not medicated or not treated. It's not being managed in any way. They're genuinely homeless and struggling with some high level mental health stuff. Like religion for a lot of people provided structure that they didn't have in other places of their lives. So it'd be like they found a Jehovah's Witness hall, or they joined some religion, and those structures were helpful. They got healthier, and then those structures, that rigid structure, became really unhelpful. It became harmful to them as they got healthier as people, maybe got medication, managed what they were working with. Then they realized, oh, that rigid structure is actually like really restricting for my growth. So it is that back and forth where it can be beneficial in very limited contexts, and then, right, like you said, long term ends up being a negative or a net loss.
I see that with addiction culture too.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this interplay between the intensity of high control religion and addictions with substances, where religion provides an escape and the spiritual bypassing and not having to learn how to deal with your emotions because you turn it over to God. And so when people get out of the religion, it's not uncommon for them to develop some type of substance use disorder. But then the flip side of that is that people trying to get out of addiction will gravitate towards high control religion.
Right. Yeah.
It fulfills that need to have something outside of yourself to take away your pain and your distress. And so this interplay with mental health and neurodivergence and addiction, it all feeds in to the same issues and exacerbates them in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I just watched a long post. A sex therapist kind of go on a diatribe about like sex addiction isn't a thing. Like sex therapists don't talk about that. But what they see is people who have religious beliefs struggling with compulsive behaviors. And like that gets termed addiction and it becomes personal responsibility. And that was something for me with ADHD too that was really hard because like sin is personal responsibility. Like you have to take responsibility for these things. And so there's a lack of understanding and a lack of compassion in these things that then turns into like spiritual battles. It's the devil or it's temptation or you need to pray more or have more faith, and that isn't helpful. Like that doesn't get people to the places that they're trying to go.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's all so connected and it's all rooted in, this disconnect from ourselves and being able to tune in to what's best for ourselves, what's aligned, being able to self-regulate. There's so much dysregulation with people who grow up or were converted into high control religions. And so when people are able to realign with who they are authentically, when they're able to develop those tools and skills for regulation, some of these other things resolve. This need for extreme religiosity or the substance or, some of these compulsions, as you were talking about, it resolves. But I'm sure this was probably your experience with religion too. Seeking out mental health support for these types of issues was not encouraged because they were very much viewed as those spiritual issues.
Yeah. Yes. My mom, who I have a good relationship with, I don't want to throw shade at my mom, but my family's still very religious. And like my mom doesn't believe in psychology. Like she has said that to me multiple times. And she supports me. She supports that I own my own business. She helped me when I needed to pay like an exorbitant amount when I first started my practice for like a lease that I should have never signed. But she's supportive, but she has that block of like, I like that mental health is scary. Mental health is threatening to kind of the structure of a very conservative type of evangelical that we were. So I see it often where it's again like love and support for me, the person, but not for the work that I do because that's scary. Not even getting into the religious trauma piece, just psychology in general. So yeah, I think there is still a lot of resistance to those things that could be seen as threats that when you're outside religion, you're like, oh no, that's so much healthier. Like, let me help you. There's joy at the end of this. There's health and there's good stuff.
Because psychology helps people to think more broadly about the human experience and about their relationships with others, and that is threatening to a high control religion that tells you they have the answers on how everything is supposed to be structured, your relationship with the world, and others and even yourself. And as you said, yourself doesn't even really factor into that because you are just putting your head down, doing the work, gaining converts, and then the reward is in the afterlife.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh, it's so gross. I want to change direction just a little bit here. You posted recently that you were starting with the Global Center for Religious Research and going through some religious trauma there, which is what I did. That's where I went through. So I'm curious if you want to, I don't know how far you are into it, but as some overlap professionally, it's a thing I can talk about too. How'd you find that? What was kind of your experience been with that so far?
I would say I'm about 30% of the way through it. It's 30 or 32 different presenters who present about an hour long on their topic, and then there's a Q&A at the end. I enjoy it because not all of the presenters are anti-religion. Some of the presenters are in ministry of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And they speak to religious harm, and they also speak to the benefit of religion in people's lives when done well. That has been something I have really had to grapple with. That is something I actually just had a session with a client this morning. We were talking a lot about this because when you experience religious harm, it is very difficult to interact with any aspect of religion without feeling activated and not having a desire to just throw it all out. Like it's all bad. And that is black and white thinking.
Yep.
The other way.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I definitely I did that once I finally was like comfortable saying, oh, I'm an atheist. Then I went through like an angry atheist phase, which I think a lot of people do. But that's when I was doing my training. And so that was, for me, very similar in that like, oh, this person's a pastor, like major red flags. And like, so I had to challenge some of my biases and work through some of those things. I loved very much the style, the presentation for my style of learning. Having kind of, here's 30 different topics was really good. And the go at your own pace was really helpful for me. So yeah, I liked that, and it's every aspect of my schooling has been very much, here's something your brain triggers on, go learn more about it, which has been really helpful for me to kind of dig in these different ways. But yeah, it's challenging to see the harm or experience the harm and know what you're looking for, and then have space for people who still want to be religious or who are still looking for, like you said, a church that does it well. Which even when you said that, my brain was like, well, is there such a thing?
Exactly. And I haven't found that. I haven't really looked very hard.
Yeah.
I haven't really found that. However, to circle back to Stephen Hassan, he is one of the ones that really helped me understand that religion can be a very important part of the human experience, and spirituality, of course. I think most people can accept the spirituality can be, but some people really like that structure, and that not all religious institutions are black and white. We have the capital T on truth. If you don't believe this, then you're going to suffer eternal torment, etc.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I personally will ever get there, because I have experienced so much harm around religious institutions. But I do have to acknowledge that that is something that some people find value in, and it actually adds something positive to their life. Stephen Hassan is Jewish, and I don't know a lot about the Jewish belief structure, but my understanding and hearing from him is that it's very community oriented, and it's about creating a better world for everybody. And it's not about you believe this or you're going to hell kind of thing.
Yeah. We sent our boys, and my wife briefly worked at for a year, a Jewish preschool, because they had Reggio Emilia approach, which is really very developmentally appropriate. It's actually from a psychologist who created like a format for early childhood. And the only place in our area that offered it was a Jewish school. And for me, I come out as atheist and kind of deconstructed. It was very weird to go be around people who were religious who weren't evangelical, because that was my whole sphere of influence. So it was like the people who were Jewish would do the Jewish thing, and they had no interest in explaining it to me or converting me or trying to get me, like, it was like you go to the school but you're not Jewish, and that's fine. Like there was a weird, and I was like, oh, that's very like freeing and nice. That's so pleasant that like you can have space for your thing, but I don't feel any obligation to participate. So it is interesting, and I try and be open to those things. I'm involved in an atheo-pagan community, which is non-theistic, no gods or goddesses. But even in that, like it's very science forward, and I still have some like tension around things that come up as either being non-scientific or like veering into like, oh, that's weird. But I think religion and spirituality address a human need, it did not create a human need. Like, we like community, we like ritual. Our brains fire and light up in all these ways around ritual. And for a lot of people, that's where organized religion comes in. It's community and it's ritual, and both those things are good. It's just whether or not an organized religion can do it without the harm.
One of the things that I think people in my community have shared that they struggle with the most is the loss of community once they have deconstructed. Mm-hmm. And I have experienced that. You know, that was my whole world. As I shared earlier, I grew up in a small town. Religion was my social environment because I was homeschooled. And then I went to a Christian school. So all of my friendships were based in shared beliefs. Mm-hmm. So when I stepped away from that, I have a couple of friendships that have continued, but there's a bit of a barrier there because I might be projecting on them based on how I used to think about non-believers, but I think that they probably view me a little bit as suspect now. Like, we can't, like, she's gone off the path, she's strayed, like, we're going to extend God's love to her, but, you know, and that, again, that could be a projection. And I do think that there is authenticity based on our years of friendship, but it has been a loss of community. And that's what I have a Facebook group as well. And that's part of why I started that group, is so that people can meet other people in this space and begin to hopefully form relationships, because it is hard. It's hard to even know how to go about forming relationships when the only criteria to this point in your life has been whether you believe the same things about God. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know, you can comment on your experience, but it was kind of like I use this analogy a lot, but like the Wizard of Oz, like peeking behind the curtain and seeing, you know, there's no magic to it. Like, realizing a lot of those friendships that I had were only based on the fact that we were both Christian. Like, and so not being a Christian then meant there was no basis. And for me, that made it easy to let a lot of them go. But in the work that I do with people, I can see how like that hurts so many of these people. Like, it's so hurtful to come to that realization of like, we didn't have a friendship underneath that, because that is getting in the way of any sort of authentic relationship. So I often refer to that as like a weeding out process. Like, you'll find the people who care about you for you, and not just because you have a similar belief system.
Yeah. And that's very much been my experience as well. It's, I think, what a lot of people struggle with. I'm a millennial, and our age group is, once you are through school and establishing your career, developing new adult friendships and meeting people that don't already have their little community, it's kind of hard to break into that. Yeah. It's been a slow process. One thing I do talk about too, and this isn't to, you know, shame people by any means, but I do feel like social development is stunted in a way in these religious communities, because, as you said, the only basis of the friendship is on shared beliefs. And so we don't develop the skill set to go out and explore even our own interests, much less how we connect with someone over a shared interest.
Right. Yeah. I'm doing to force myself to blog. I picked Stephen Hassan's bite model to blog about because it's a topic I talk about regularly, and there's 4 easy parts. So like, hey, 4 blogs out of that. But it's that development, that stunted development is there in like all those factors of the bite model that there's control also creates the potential. I won't say everybody has these delays, but like a delay in maturation and being able to be emotionally mature or to be intellectually mature. A lot of people don't get those. And so then you have like, oh, I'm anxious approaching someone, or I'm awkward in this social setting, and not having the skill set to work through that and then build and grow a relationship, but just kind of shutting down or feeling overwhelmed or you can't stick with it. So yeah, I see that often too. Making adult friends is hard, but like there are things about the religious upbringing that make it harder.
Yes. And you mentioned emotional immaturity too, which I see as connected but separate from the stunted social development. And I was just answering on my Q&A yesterday about people really resonate with posts about emotionally immature parents because we see a lot of emotionally immature humans in these cultures. And children are really harmed by growing up with emotionally immature parents, but talking about how people with emotional immaturity are attracted to the religion because it gives you the framework for how to live your life and for how to deal with your emotions. Well, you don't deal with your emotions, you just hand them over to an all-powerful deity to deal with. But then it stunts emotional development as well, because you're not allowed to be angry, or you're allowed to have righteous anger that's separate from feeling anger about anything personally. And any strong or hard or difficult or complex emotions are just, you turn it over to God, you pray about it, but it's not something that you work through as a family typically. And I know that's a broad generalization, and I'm sure there are families that do process emotions in a healthier way, but that's not what the format is,
right?
But as taught by a high control religious institution.
Yeah, and it's my background is marriage and family therapy. Like that's my license, and that's what I studied first. And it's one of those things where I look at the intergenerational approach too. If you're growing up in a family that has been a certain religion for multiple generations, these things are even more ingrained. And for me, someone who's deconstructed, holding space for like my parents to be still religious and not aware of the harm that they've always perpetrated, but also they're victims because they were raised in the same environment. And that's really hard for people. Like that's work we do maybe further down in the therapy process, but getting to that place where you can see someone as both in essence a perpetrator and a victim themselves, like that's, again, for those of us who have black and white thinking, that's uncomfortable. We want it to be, this person was a bad parent because of this. And then when you look at it, it's like, oh, well, they were also raised in that religious setting too. It's, I don't know, unsatisfactory to not have that black and white ability to apply terms or roles to people.
Totally. I think that the single most helpful phrase or terminology is the idea of compassion and self-compassion when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up believing that empathy was the be all and end all. And I've realized that, in the mental health space, having empathy and stepping into somebody else's human experience, etc., is what is most important. But I've realized that empathy is not always a good thing, because when you step into somebody else's experience, it is really, you are taking on their emotions and their baggage in a way. And so when you're trying to make sense of a perpetrator, a victim, and a perpetrator was a victim, you can't do that in an empathetic space because it'll make your head explode.
Yeah.
So compassion is an extending out of kindness and goodwill, and it's sort of holding space, but it's outside of your experience. And so when you can wrap someone in compassion and you can wrap yourself in compassion, you can hold these multiple truths. They hurt me and they were hurt.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that comes up in your work or not.
Yeah, I mean, I do. It's been an adaptation from couples work that I've done for so long. And I'm going to start with a caveat to say I don't do this in what I consider to be toxic or abusive situations. It does not work if there is intentional abuse. But we have an exercise that we do in couples work where it's hero, victim, villain, and how each person in that couple can play each role simultaneously. And it's not necessarily designed to explain blame or to figure out who was right or who was wrong. It's just an exercise. It's a thought experiment to kind of move away from that black and white thinking, from that right and wrong thinking, and create space for you can have had the best of intentions to be a hero and still harmed your partner. And in their view, you're the villain and you can still be the victim. And all those things can be happening simultaneously. And like my brain likes that because I'm ADHD. So I want to process 6 different things at one time. I've learned working with people who are not ADHD, it's a much more uncomfortable experience. My brain's like lighting up just talking about it. I have so much dopamine in my head right now. So it's been a thing I've used in couples therapy for a long time, and then kind of adapting it. It's been tricky when it's trauma, and I've had to adapt it a little bit because I think that changes it. I don't start with this. This is not a first session experience. This is once we've done a lot of unpacking, we're safe, we've done any sort of trauma work we need to do, we've done compassion work. And I liked that kind of dichotomy you drew between empathy and compassion, that those are different things and they lead to different results. I think that's, I want to say Kristen Neff, but I think I'm getting her name wrong.
She is the self-compassion person. Kristen Neff is.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have, it's open on my tabs right now. It's something I share so often with clients that like that compassion work really, I think often has to come first for people.
Well, speaking of Kristen Neff, in my earlier comment on anger, her last book that I'm aware of is Fierce Self-Compassion, which talks about the role of anger, and that anger is an indicator that a boundary has been violated, and that compassion can actually, harnessing that intensity of anger can be a very useful tool for people. And I don't know about you, but I've experienced a lot of anger in the deconstruction space, and people kind of get stuck in anger. And I think I love her perspective on it because it talks about using anger in a very useful way, to create change or to activate a healing process or to set a boundary. So as you brought up Kristen Neff and her work, I just wanted to talk about her work with anger too, because that's something that people who are deconstructing deal with, a lot of anger. Yeah.
And boundaries being broken. I started out in my career as a Christian counselor, so I used to do the Boundaries book, which was written by a pastor or something. What I could take back from my Christian days. But again, like that's a whole nother separate topic on boundaries and not having a good concept of them. Boundaries are a whole separate concept, I think, as far as what people, because we talked about this several times now, but when you aren't prioritizing yourself, when self isn't an entity that you have to think about, it's very hard to have healthy boundaries. And my background's marriage and family therapy, so I don't work with kids anymore, but I work with a lot of adult children who are trying to figure out, like, they've deconstructed, what do their boundaries with their family look like? That's a big topic in the deconstruction space of how do I maintain these relationships with people who have different belief systems, or who think I've fallen away or I've lost myself, or leave passive aggressive Christian books on the coffee table whenever I come to visit, like whatever it looks like, seeing those things and how do we navigate those boundaries? That's a big topic for people too.
Well, and I just thought of something as you were talking about boundaries, is how boundaries are used in the Christian space to keep harmful, again, I'm using air quotes here, harmful influences out.
Mhm.
So what we grow up to think of as a healthy boundary is really a psychologically harmful behavior, because we're practicing things like thought stopping, which is something that Stephen
Yeah.
Hansen talks about. That is an aspect of cult mind controls and isolation, separating us from the world. So our whole concept of boundaries is so distorted because the boundaries are walls of protection, and they're not, in a healthy context, boundaries are more like fences that have a gate, and that sometimes you can go through, or you can make exceptions to things, or they can be flexible. So I don't know what your experience with that was in your Christian community, but for me, it's not that we never talked about boundaries. Now, we weren't supposed to really have personal boundaries. We were supposed to give endlessly of ourselves in the service of others.
Yes.
But there were a lot of boundaries around keeping harmful influences out.
Yeah. And I would say, I mean, that's part of my deconstruction when I was moving more and more liberal and more progressive, was doing boundaries work with people based in science and psychology, not based on my religious upbringing, and realizing that, like, to this day, one of the things that gets the strongest responses from people is when I say boundaries aren't for other people, boundaries are for you. You're setting your boundary for you. And so I was like, wait, what? And especially when people have been raised in that high control religion, like, that's not how boundaries are talked about. Boundaries are for other people. Boundaries are, as you said, to keep things away or to keep people out. And so it's a paradigm shift for a lot of people to understand, like, you're setting your boundary for you. You can't control other people. You're just doing this for you, what's healthy for you. And so there's that paradigm shift for sure. I found that to be very freeing in my personal experience. Like, that instantly felt so much healthier.
Yeah, I agree. And it gives you space to identify what types of things you want to let into your world, because it's in alignment with your values, versus what things you do want to still keep separate. And that can be hard in the deconstruction space too, because when you start to contemplate that these things that you've been taught might be incorrect, you start to doubt everything you were ever taught. And then it's everything full. It's like the walls come down and you haven't learned the healthy boundary space. And so everything floods in, and that can be very scary for people.
Yeah. It's where therapy is an inexact science. Is often in arts. I've had lots of people who have an early success in setting boundaries, and then, like, they experience it as this freeing, wonderful thing that I think it is. And then I have people who are setting boundaries with someone who isn't interested in a boundary or is a bad faith actor in the boundary, and they get very frustrated very quickly with, like, but I set my boundary, why isn't it working? And so it's just, I think getting some success and experiencing the healthy version of it really helps. It's nice to have a blueprint of what not to do, but that blueprint of what to do instead is even more important. And I think that's the piece that's missing for a lot of people is, I know what I don't like, or I deconstructed what I don't believe anymore, but I'm not sure what to do in its place.
Well, yes. And I think even before you get to the boundary setting phase or readjusting boundaries in a healthy way, it's being able to identify what's safe and not safe.
Yeah.
Because what you're conditioned to believe is not safe is usually perfectly acceptable. And the call is coming from inside the house kind of thing. Like, we were indoctrinated to believe in demons and hell and all these terrifying things is really what harms us.
Yeah, for sure. Hell trauma, whole separate thing. What I'm gonna do a little bit of a left turn again here. Working in this field, working with clients who are dealing with potential issues like trauma or some of these heavy high control things, or someone who's coming out of a cult. What do you do personally? How do you kind of decompress? What's your stress relief? What's your self-care? What is joy in your life? Kind of walk us through. When you're not in the therapy room, what are you doing to take care of yourself?
I think that that changes all the time. I think that is part of ADHD that I had to embrace is the same thing does not work for a prolonged period of time for me. And so I need to embrace something I call flexible structure, where I have an idea that I need to create space to take care of myself, but the activities I do and the time I spend doing it can look different.
Yeah, I
So
love that.
yeah, so I would say my mornings are really sacred to me. That has been something that hasn't changed throughout my whole life. So I know that starting work later in the morning is very important to my mental well-being because it gives space to have contemplation, to do journaling if I want to. I do a lot of reading in the morning when my mind is fresh, listening to podcasts or the religious trauma training. I sometimes listen to a speaker in the morning. So all of those things really set my day up for success. And the other aspect of self-care that is very important that I don't always prioritize in the way I should is some kind of physical activity.
Yeah.
And being able to reset my nervous system. I've learned that if I do have a few sessions like late morning, going in the afternoon, doing some kind of exercise, coming home and kind of having a second half to the day then after that is actually works really well for me. So I think it's a combination of many things, but learning how to give myself flexibility to incorporate it in the way that feels right today, because one thing might work for 2 days, it might work for 2 months, and then I'm completely over journaling for like a year. So actually it's never been a year. I'm a pretty consistent journaler, but these things kind of come and go. So I have my toolkit and then I bring different things in at different times.
Yeah. I relate to that so deeply. I love the flexible structure. I have this metaphor I use, and for my clients who are listening to my podcast, they're going to roll their eyes because they've heard it. But I talk about like a jungle gym, like the metal monkey bars, like that structure is solid. It's made out of metal. It's concrete. It's in the ground. It's not going anywhere. But whether you're doing pull-ups, whether you're racing across it, whether you're sitting on the top gossiping with friends, like how you use the structure looks a lot different. So I love that idea of like, right, you have the space for something, what you're going to fill that space with looks different each day or for me, my ADHD tends to go in waves of 3 to 6 months. So I'll be on something for a while, or my physical activity is very important to me. I'm an athlete. I grew up with sports everywhere, but my workout routine changes often because I cannot do the same workout for 6 months. Like my brain won't. So having space for like, I know I need to exercise, but it's okay if one day it's the exercise bike and one day it's taking the dogs for a walk and one day it's something else. Like the space is there. How I fill the space is going to look different.
Yeah. And I think that being able to embrace that for me has been part of my healing from religious trauma as well, because it's so ingrained in you to have these spiritual disciplines and there is not flexibility.
Yeah.
So to give myself permission and compassion to have flexibility, even with a gym workout, for example, it doesn't have to be a rigid routine. Today, my body feels more tired. I'm going to walk on the treadmill for half an hour, and that's okay.
Yeah. My processing of my ADHD has gotten so much healthier once I deconstructed. Like, it sounds weird as a mental health professional who's known these things and worked with neurodivergent people for a long time, but like just the way I experience it myself has changed a lot once I stepped away from organized religion. Like, so that space, the space I hold for myself looks so much different than it used to, and that's been much healthier.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that is the self-compassion piece too. Like this is how my brain works, and I am going to have the compassion for myself to support it in the way that it needs.
Yeah. Last-ish question here. I'd like to ask what's on your bookshelf? What are you reading? What are you watching? What are you kind of taking in, whether that's professional stuff or recreational stuff? Kind of how are you, again, some of that time out of the therapy room, what's going on then?
Well, I often have several different books going at once, and unfortunately, I have this habit of not completing books or letting them go for a long time and then circling back to them. I'm really deep into that religious trauma training right now, and
Mhm.
part of what I'm also trying to do is dive deep into attachment theory. And Stephen Hassan recommended this book, but it's this monster book. It's 750 pages. It's huge, but it takes a deep, deep dive into attachment theory. So that's the kind of thing I'm reading for fun,
Yes,
which
right.
might not sound fun to most people, but for me, these books that advance my therapeutic skills are pleasurable for me
Yeah.
to read. So
Mhm.
that's sort of what is on my bookshelf right now. I'm curious to see how far I get into this book since I
Yeah.
do have a tendency to not complete, but
Yeah.
it's been awesome right now.
Yeah. I have, I think, 8 or 9 books from the library in my office right now. And it's like, oh, shoot, they're due in 3 days. I better power through and skim read a bunch of them.
Right.
Not the best way to do it. Megan, where can people find you if they want to learn more about your practice and check out some of your work? I've said you're great on social media, so where can people find you?
So my Instagram is reclaimingself.therapy, but of course, if you search for my name, that's going to show up because I think
Yeah.
I'm the only Megan Von Fricken around. And my website is meganvonfricken.com. So I have some blog posts on there and some opportunities to connect on there. And I also have a private Facebook group called the Religious Harm Recovery Group. I think if people search for it on Facebook, it will come up, but you can also access it through my website or even on Instagram on the little link. The link has a opportunity to navigate to that as well.
Yeah, and we'll have all that stuff in the show notes. I love your Instagram account is it's shockingly concise for how complicated of topics you write about. So good job being a good writer. You do a nice job of kind of articulating some complex theory and topics, and just, it's not these 10 click through these 10 slides. It's one thing, introducing a concept, explaining how it works. So I love that. Strong recommend for people to follow you on social media. I think it's you put out a lot of good information.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
so yeah, we'll have all that stuff in the show notes so it's easy to find. Megan, thanks so much for taking the time and coming on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me. This has been great.
Yeah, and to all our wonderful listeners out there, thanks for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.